A Crucible of Blood and Memory, the historical analysis of American military casualties. The history of the United States is inextricably bound to the blood spilled in its defense, its continental expansion, and its global projection of power. From the earliest localized skirmishes of the American Revolution to the precision drone warfare and counterinsurgency operations of the 21st century, the American military casualty has evolved from a shared community tragedy into a highly politicized metric of national resolve. To trace the history of American military casualties is to trace the evolution of the nation itself. This examination requires a comprehensive analysis of the shifting lethality of combat, the miraculous yet profoundly complex advancements in military medicine, the cultural reverberations of mass loss, and the ever-changing arithmetic of public support for war. The burden of military sacrifice, once borne broadly by a conscripted and mobilized republic, has gradually narrowed to an insulated, specialized warrior caste. This demographic and cultural shift has fundamentally altered the American idea of war, civic duty, and national myth-making. The calculus of sacrifice, quantitative trends and longitudinal demographics. The scale of American military casualties has fluctuated wildly across the centuries, dictated by the mobilization requirements of the era, the geographic scope of the conflict, the lethality of contemporary weaponry, and the total population of the United States. In the nascent days of the Republic, casualty figures were relatively small in absolute terms, but they were deeply significant relative to the population. The first recorded casualties of the American Revolutionary cause occurred even before the formal declaration of armed conflict. Crispus Attucks, a whaler and stevedore of African and indigenous descent, was killed during the Boston Massacre on March 5, 1770, becoming an early martyr for a burgeoning revolutionary cause and a subsequent icon for the abolitionist movement. 5 years later, Isaac Davis, a gunsmith from Massachusetts serving as a Minuteman, became the first commissioned officer to fall at the Battle of Concord on April 19, 1775. Throughout the Revolutionary War, the Continental Army and associated colonial militias suffered approximately 4,435 battle deaths and 6,188 non-mortal wounds out of a serving force of 217,000. However, when factoring in deaths from disease, starvation, and exposure, particularly among prisoners of war held in squalid British prison ships, the total death toll is estimated to be around 23,800 to 25,000. Against a colonial population of roughly 2.5 million in 1776, this death toll represented approximately 1.00% of the total populace, a demographic impact that remains one of the highest in the nation's history. The Revolutionary War also established the grim precedent of combatants falling into enemy hands or disappearing on the battlefield. Historical records indicate over 18,152 prisoners of war and 1,426 missing in action during the conflict. The subsequent War of 1812 and the Mexican-American War saw casualty rates that were comparatively modest in relation to the rapidly expanding demographic base of the United States, yet they maintained high mortality rates due to disease and rudimentary medical care. The War of 1812 resulted in 2,260 battle deaths and approximately 15,000 total deaths, including disease, out of a population of roughly 8 million, 0.21%. During this conflict, a staggering 20,000 Americans were taken prisoner. The Mexican-American War 1846 to 1848 showcased a severe disparity between combat and non-combat fatalities. While 1,733 soldiers died in battle, over 11,550 died from disease and other causes, yielding a total of 13,283 deaths against a population of 21.4 million, 0.06%. However, the American Civil War inaugurated an era of industrialized slaughter that remains the deadliest conflict in American history by an overwhelming margin. The conflict yielded an estimated 655,000 to 850,000 total dead from both the Union and the Confederacy, with the Union alone suffering 140,414 battle deaths and 224,097 non-combat deaths. With a national population of just over 31.4 million in 1860, the Civil War claimed the lives of over 2.11% of the American populace. The scale of imprisonment was equally catastrophic, with 194,743 Union soldiers and 214,865 Confederate soldiers listed as POWs or MIA, tens of thousands of whom perished in notorious camps like Andersonville. Because regiments were raised locally, casualties often devastated specific geographic communities in a single afternoon. For instance, the 26th North Carolina Regiment suffered a catastrophic 714 casualties out of 800 men during the Battle of Gettysburg, while the University Grays of the 11th Mississippi suffered 100% casualties during Pickett's charge. The 20th century expanded American military engagements to an unprecedented global scale. World War I, though a relatively brief engagement for American forces, saw 116,516 American deaths, 53,402 in battle, 63,114 from disease and other causes, heavily exacerbated by the 1918 influenza pandemic in a compressed time frame. This represented 0.11% of a population that had swelled to over 103 million. The first American military casualty of the war was Lieutenant William G. Fitzsimmons, a medical officer killed in a German air attack on a hospital in France in September 1917, highlighting the indiscriminate nature of modern warfare. World War II stands as the deadliest conflict in human history, and for the United States, it required the total mobilization of over 16 million service members. The United States suffered 405,399 dead and 671,278 wounded. The first American casualty of this global conflagration actually occurred a year and a half before Pearl Harbor. Captain Robert Moffett Lossy, a military attaché observing the conflict in Europe, was killed by a German bomb in Norway in April 1940. During the war, the U.S. military also suffered heavily in terms of captured personnel, with 130,201 captured and interned, of whom 14,072 died while in captivity. Despite the staggering absolute numbers, the demographic impact relative to the burgeoning population, approximately 133.4 million in 1940, was roughly 0.31%. Following World War II, the paradigm of American casualties shifted dramatically. Wars became protracted, asymmetrical, and highly localized, fought under the shadow of nuclear deterrence. The Korean War, 1950 to 1953, resulted in 36,574 total deaths and 103,284 wounded, alongside 7,140 POWs and 8,025 MIAs. The Vietnam War claimed 58,220 American lives and left over 153,000 wounded requiring hospital care out of a population of 179 million, representing a demographic impact of just 0.032%. By the time of the Global War on Terror, including Operation Iraqi Freedom (WAF) and Operation Enduring Freedom (OF) in Afghanistan, the casualty percentage relative to the total U.S. population had dropped to microscopic levels, 0.002% and 0.001%, respectively. The war in Afghanistan resulted in 2,432 deaths, while the Iraq War claimed 4,576 lives. Even minor engagements and prolonged advisory missions in the modern era, such as Operation Inherent Resolve (WIRE) and Operation Prosperity Guardian, generate intense scrutiny. The January 2024 drone attack by Iranian-backed militias on the Tower 22 outpost in Jordan, which resulted in the deaths of 3 Army reservists and injuries to 47 others, triggered massive geopolitical responses despite being statistically minute compared to the battles of previous centuries. Comprehensive casualty data across major American conflicts. Pipe war or conflict. Pipe total used deaths. Pipe total wounded. Pipe POW/MIA est. Pipe used population, year. Pipe deaths as percent of pop. Pipe pipe dash 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 pipe. Pipe American Revolutionary War. Pipe tilde 23,800 25,000. Pipe 6,188. Pipe 18,152. POW/1,426. MIA. Pipe 2,500,000 1780. Pipe 1.00%. Pipe War of 1812. Pipe tilde 15,000. Pipe 4,505. Pipe 20,000. POW/695. MIA. Pipe 8,000,000 1810. Pipe 0.21%. Pipe Mexican-American War. Pipe 13,283. Pipe 4,152. Pipe 46. POW/238. MIA. Pipe 21,406,000 1850. Pipe 0.06%. Pipe American Civil War. Pipe tilde 655,000. Pipe 281,881. Union. Pipe tilde 409,608. Combined. Pipe 31,443,000 1860. Pipe 2.11%. Pipe Spanish-American War. Pipe 2,246. Pipe 1,662. Pipe 8 POW/72. MIA. Pipe 62,022,250 1890. Pipe 0.004%. Pipe World War I. Pipe 116,516. Pipe 204,002. Pipe 7,470. Combined. Pipe 103,268,000 1920. Pipe 0.11%. Pipe World War II. Pipe 405,399. Pipe 671,278. Pipe 130,201. POW/30,314. MIA. Pipe 133,402,000 1940. Pipe 0.31%. Pipe Korean War. Pipe 36,574. Pipe 103,284. Pipe 7,140. POW/8025. MIA. Pipe 151,325,000 1950. Pipe 0.024%. Pipe Vietnam War. Pipe 58,220. Pipe 153,303. HOSP. Pipe 766. POW/1719. MIA. Pipe 179,323,175 1970. Pipe 0.032%. Pipe Gulf War. Pipe 383. Pipe 467. Pipe 29. POW/21. MIA. Pipe 248,709,873 1990. Pipe less than 0.001%. Pipe War in Afghanistan. Pipe 2,432. Pipe tilde 20,000 plus. Pipe minimal/1 POW. Bergdahl. Pipe 294,043,000 2010. Pipe 0.001%. Pipe Iraq War. Pipe 4,576. Pipe tilde 32,223. Pipe minimal/recovered. Pipe 294,043,000 2010. Pipe 0.002%. Pipe data aggregated from Department of Defense, Congressional Research Service, Department of Veterans Affairs, and Census Bureau. Historical records. Revolutionary War, War of 1812, and Mexican-American War. Death estimates heavily reflect deaths from disease, starvation, and captivity. The demographic isolation of the modern casualty. The societal distribution of these casualties has undergone a profound transformation, moving from a shared national sacrifice to an isolated burden. During World War II, 38.8% of the military were volunteers and 61.2% were draftees. resulting in approximately 12% of the total U.S. population serving in the armed forces at some point during the conflict. This saturation meant that the vast majority of American citizens had a direct, familial connection to the war effort and its associated casualties. The implementation of the draft during the Vietnam War similarly socialized the risk of combat across various strata of American society, although draft deferments meant the burden disproportionately affected lower income and minority populations, fueling intense social unrest. However, the transition to the all-volunteer force in 1973 fundamentally insulated the broader public from the physical blood cost of American foreign policy. By the time of the prolonged engagements in Iraq and Afghanistan, the burden of warfare had fallen disproportionately upon a tiny, self-selecting fraction of the American population, less than 1% of the public. This isolation has generated a phenomenon defined by sociologists as military exceptionalism, wherein service members are segregated from civilian society, creating a deep civil-military divide. Casualties in the 21st century are no longer a shared national trauma experienced in nearly every neighborhood. Rather, they are acute tragedies absorbed by an insular warrior class. This demographic isolation forces a re-evaluation of how the American public processes war, as the physical consequences of combat remain distant, abstract, and easily ignored for the overwhelming majority of the voting populace. From disease to IEDs, the evolution of lethality and the nature of combat. The history of American military casualties is not merely a record of enemy action. For most of the nation's history, it has been a chronicle of infectious disease and rudimentary sanitation. Until the mid-20th century, a soldier's greatest threat was not the bullet or the bayonet, but microscopic pathogens. In the American Civil War, twice as many soldiers died from diseases, such as dysentery, typhoid fever, pneumonia, and typhus, as from hostile action. This deadly trend continued through the Spanish-American War in 1898, where tropical diseases like yellow fever and malaria decimated the ranks, killing 9 times as many American troops as Spanish combatants did. The paradigm shifted definitively during World War II, which became the first major conflict in American history where battle deaths outnumbered non-combat and disease-related deaths. By the Vietnam War, deaths from disease had been reduced to just 1/5 of those caused by combat, largely due to the emergence of deployment medicine, the mass production of penicillin, robust prophylactic immunizations, and rigorous military public health standards. The changing nature of the physical wound. As the overarching threat of disease waned, the lethality and nature of weaponry evolved at a staggering pace, forcing military medicine into a constant state of reactive innovation. During the Civil War, the introduction of the rifled musket and the mini-A-ball fundamentally altered the mechanics of trauma. The mini-A-ball, a heavy, conical lead projectile with a hollow base that expanded into the rifling of the barrel, shattered bone and destroyed soft tissue upon impact in a manner far more destructive than the solid round balls of earlier smoothbore muskets. Because the parabolic trajectory of the bullet was difficult for poorly trained soldiers to master at long ranges, most combat remained at close quarters, often under 100 yards, maximizing the weapon's destructive capability and resulting in catastrophic extremity wounds that overwhelmingly necessitated rapid field amputation to stave off infection. In World War I and World War II, the primary engine of casualties shifted from small arms to artillery and mechanized, combined arms warfare. Artillery was responsible for approximately 2/3 of all deaths and injuries on the Western Front in World War I. The concussive force and jagged shrapnel of high-explosive shells obliterated bodies in ways previously unseen in human history, leading to a massive increase in facial disfigurements which spurred the birth of modern plastic surgery, traumatic amputations, and profound neurological damage. In the post-9/11 conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, the signature weapon of the enemy became the improvised explosive device (IED). In response to highly advanced American Kevlar body armor and armored vehicles, insurgents utilized asymmetric blast weapons that directed explosive energy upward from the ground. while body armor successfully protected the thorax and abdomen, drastically reducing the fatal torso wounds that characterized earlier wars. The extremities and the head remained highly vulnerable to the blast wave and fragmentation. Consequently, the 21st century casualty is uniquely characterized by traumatic brain injury, TBI, complex pelvic fractures, and multiple limb amputations. The medical revolution, from the flying ambulance to the golden hour. To combat the increasing lethality of modern weaponry, the United States military medical apparatus underwent a profound revolution, driving survival rates to unprecedented highs. Over the 250 years of American history, the ratio of deaths to total wounded decreased dramatically from roughly 42% during the Revolutionary War to 33% in the Civil War, 30% in World War II, and plummeting to just 10% during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. A comprehensive study analyzing combat casualty statistics noted that the combat fatality rate fell from 55% at the start of World War II to roughly 12% in recent conflicts, with the killed in action (KIA) rate falling from 52% to 5%. If a casualty in the global war on terror arrived alive at a combat hospital, they possessed an astonishing 98% chance of survival. The foundation for this system began in the 19th century, drawing inspiration from Napoleonic medical innovations such as the flying ambulance for rapid evacuation and the triage system to prioritize care based on the severity of the wound. By World War II, the exogenous introduction of penicillin and whole blood transfusions drastically reduced mortality from infection and shock, expediting the return of soldiers to duty and significantly improving the loss exchange ratio against adversaries lacking such medical logistics. This statistical triumph in the modern era is primarily attributed to the mastery of the golden hour, the critical 60-minute window following an injury in which advanced medical intervention is most effective. The establishment of Tactical Combat Casualty Care (TCCC) in the late 1990s fundamentally altered pre-hospital treatment. TCCC empowered frontline combatants, not just medics, to administer life-saving interventions at the immediate point of injury. Longitudinal studies of the Afghanistan and Iraq conflicts indicate that three specific interventions, the aggressive and liberal use of combat tourniquets, early blood transfusions at the point of injury, and rapid pre-hospital transport by a dedicated helicopter medevac, were directly associated with 44.2% of the total reduction in mortality. However, this medical proficiency has generated a complex secondary consequence, the burden of survivability. By saving service members who would have unequivocally died on the battlefield in previous wars, military medicine has created a generation of veterans living with profound, chronic, and highly complex physical disabilities. The ratio of amputations to wounded rose drastically compared to previous conflicts, shifting the cost of war from acute battlefield mortality to a requirement for lifelong, highly specialized rehabilitative care provided by the Department of Veterans Affairs. The psychic wound, post-traumatic stress and the hidden casualties. The historical record of American military casualties has slowly, and often reluctantly, expanded to recognize that a soldier need not bleed to be irrevocably broken by combat. The psychological casualty has existed since the dawn of American warfare, though it was initially dismissed as cowardice, malingering, or a vague physiological defect. During the Civil War, the profound psychological collapse of soldiers was sometimes labeled nostalgia, irritable heart, or soldier's heart, but it was largely untreated, as mid-19th century medicine lacked the vocabulary and the framework for psychiatric trauma. Yet, contemporary observers recognize the psychic toll. Poet Walt Whitman, who served as a volunteer nurse in Union hospitals, documented the profound mental devastation in his writings, capturing the unseen damage of the conflict. World War I introduced the term shell shock to describe the neurological and psychological shattering caused by relentless, mechanized artillery bombardment. In World War II, the military adopted the term combat fatigue, formally recognizing that even the most resilient, highly trained soldier possessed a psychological breaking point. The U.S. Army determined that an infantryman's breaking point on the front line was somewhere between 60 and 240 days of continuous combat, depending on the intensity of the theater, making psychiatric collapse an inevitable mathematical certainty of prolonged exposure to death. It was not until the aftermath of the Vietnam War, spurred by the advocacy of veterans and the comprehensive data from the National Vietnam Veterans Readjustment Survey (NVVRS), that the psychiatric casualty was formally codified. In 1980, the American Psychiatric Association officially recognized post-traumatic stress disorder (PTSD) as a distinct mental health condition, validating the invisible wounds that had haunted veterans for centuries. Today, the psychic wound is recognized as a signature casualty of modern conflict, heavily interlinked with the phenomenon of moral injury and the devastatingly high rates of veteran suicide. Tragically, mortality surveillance data from 2014 to 2019 revealed that the highest crude mortality rates among active-duty U.S. Army soldiers were not from hostile action or combat, but from suicide, frequently by gunshot or hanging, and accidental deaths. The psychological casualty continues to ripple through families long after the guns fall silent, manifesting in what veterans describe as unceasing nightmares, survivor's guilt, and a profound alienation from the civilian society they were deployed to protect. Voices from the front, first-hand accounts of loss and endurance. To understand the history of American casualties solely through statistical aggregates and medical advancements is to ignore the visceral, human dimension of warfare. The subjective experience of the casualty, and the terrifying anticipation of becoming one, has been heavily documented in letters, diaries, and memoirs that illuminate the psychological landscape of the American warfighter across the centuries. During the Revolutionary War, soldiers grappled with the shock of linear volley fire and the suddenness of death. Moses Sleeper, writing in his diary regarding the Battle of Bunker Hill in 1775, meticulously documented the barrage from British ships and the stark realization of his unit's losses in his first experience of combat. By the Civil War, soldiers were forced to reckon with an unprecedented scale of localized death. In 1862, Union soldier Samuel D. Loweyd wrote to his wife of the merciless feat of the war horse trampling the dead and dying, bemoaning the cruel and awful scourge of witnessing the slaughter of his compatriots without the comfort of family nearby. The specter of death forced a profound reckoning with personal duty versus familial love, perhaps best encapsulated by Major Sullivan Ballou of the Union Army, who wrote to his wife days before his death at the First Battle of Bull Run, "My love of country comes over me like a strong wind and bears me irresistibly with all those chains to the battlefield." By World War II, the romanticism of 19th century duty had largely been replaced by a grim, enduring pragmatism. Soldiers acknowledged the paralyzing nature of industrial warfare. As William Adelman wrote in his final letter to his wife before his death in 1944, "Any man who says he hasn't been almost petrified by fear since he's been out here isn't being honest with himself." This fear is something that we all accept and take for granted as a normal reaction. You are practically anesthetized by fear. Letters home served as vital tethers to sanity. Soldiers like Bob Dole detailed their brutal recoveries in military hospitals, while others used coded language to bypass censors and reassure their wives of their survival. The Vietnam War brought a raw, unfiltered cynicism to soldier correspondence, reflecting the controversial nature of the conflict. Soldiers wrote of the sudden, arbitrary nature of death by landmines and booby traps. A soldier named Tom wrote to his family in 1965, describing a scout stepping on a mine, "The only thing I can think of is, what a waste. Your time is coming, Uncle Sam." The anti-warrior, Tom. Helicopter pilot Nicky Venditti wrote enthusiastically to his parents just days after arriving in Vietnam in 1969, only to be killed 11 days into his tour, underscoring the abrupt termination of youth that characterized the war. In the modern era, memoirs and essays from the global war on terror reflect a deep disillusionment regarding the asymmetric nature of the casualty. Veterans describe the agonizing paranoia of IED warfare, where death arrives randomly from the roadside rather than in a pitched, definitive battle. M. Talbar, an aid worker who served alongside her military family members in Iraq and Afghanistan, described the intergenerational trauma of modern war as being frozen in the sick, ducking mortars and mourning colleagues in a cyclical war that the broader American public easily forgets or ignores. The burden of survivors' guilt is profound. Service members routinely recount the psychological devastation of missing a patrol on which their friends were killed by hidden explosives, carrying the shroud of death back to a civilian world that cannot comprehend their grief. The lens of conflict, media representation, and the shaping of public tolerance. The American public's tolerance for military casualties is not a static phenomenon. It is heavily mediated by how those casualties are depicted in the press, in literature, and through political rhetoric. As the technology of media evolved, so too did the public's visceral connection to the battlefield, shaping the cultural perception of war. The American Civil War marked the first time the realities of battlefield death were brought directly to the civilian populace through the nascent medium of photography. In 1862, photographer Alexander Gardner captured images of unburied, bloated corpses at Antietam. When Matthew Brady exhibited these photographs in his New York gallery, the grotesque reality of young men lying face down in the dirt shattered the romantic, bloodless illusions of Victorian-era combat. Images such as Timothy O'Sullivan's A Harvest of Death at Gettysburg established a legacy of war photojournalism that forced the American public to confront the physical toll of their political disputes, preventing the sanitization of the conflict. During World War I, the United States government actively sought to control the narrative of death to maintain public morale. President Woodrow Wilson established the Committee on Public Information (CPI), led by George Creel, which utilized posters, illustrations, and highly censored newsreels to mobilize the public and generate support for the war effort. The CPI generated a sanitized, heroic vision of combat, utilizing patriotism and anti-German propaganda to ensure that the massive casualty lists did not fracture domestic cohesion. This strict control over the visual representation of death largely continued through World War II, where images of dead Americans were suppressed by the Office of War Information until late in the war to maintain the unified national effort. The starkest realities of World War II were often communicated not through photographs, but through the bitter humor of Bill Mauldin's Willie and Joe cartoons, which depicted the exhausted, bedraggled infantrymen enduring the miseries of mud, fear, and death, providing a vital psychological release for the troops and a dose of reality for the home front. The Vietnam War dismantled this controlled narrative entirely. Widely considered the first living room war, television broadcasts and unrestricted photojournalism brought the chaotic, brutal reality of combat directly into American homes. While moving images were powerful, still photography proved indelible. Nick Ute's 1972 photograph, The Terror of War, often called Napalm Girl, depicting a screaming, naked child fleeing the napalm strike, and Eddie Adams's photograph of a South Vietnamese general executing a Viet Cong prisoner, fundamentally eroded the moral high ground of the American effort. These images fostered intense public revulsion, energized the anti-war movement, and demonstrated that the visual framing of casualties, both military and civilian, could single-handedly shift the strategic trajectory of a war. The trauma of Vietnam birthed the Vietnam Syndrome, a profound public and congressional disinclination to engage in foreign conflicts that might result in heavy American casualties. Recognizing this vulnerability, the U.S. military heavily restricted media access during the 1991 Persian Gulf War, implementing a multi-stage propaganda and censorship campaign to ensure public support and project an image of clean, technologically precise warfare. The advent of 24-hour news networks introduced the CNN effect, where real-time reporting of casualties or military blunders could force the hands of policymakers by inciting immediate public outrage. During the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the military utilized embedded journalism to control the perspective, aligning reporters with specific units. Consequently, modern coverage became highly sanitized compared to Vietnam. American media outlets became highly hesitant to show flagrant images of used casualties or flag-draped coffins. Today, with the proliferation of social media, the public is subjected to an instantaneous but highly fragmented stream of combat footage. Yet, despite the unprecedented volume of media, the physical reality of the American casualty remains largely hidden from view, contributing to a public that is increasingly disconnected from the blood cost of the wars fought in its name. The arithmetic of support, casualties, politics, and the public will. The assumption that the American public is inherently casualty-averse, that any significant loss of life will inevitably lead to demands for immediate withdrawal, is a dominant feature of modern political science and media commentary. However, scholarly analysis reveals a much more nuanced reality regarding how society absorbs the shock of military death. The traditional casualties hypothesis suggests a direct inverse relationship. As the human cost of a war rises, public support inevitably falls. Yet, longitudinal studies of conflicts ranging from World War II to the Iraq War demonstrate that the public's tolerance for casualties is highly elastic. This tolerance is dependent on the perceived value of the mission, the likelihood of strategic success, and the rhetoric employed by political elites. Rational expectations theory indicates that the public responds less to the cumulative absolute number of casualties and more to recent trends. If casualties are high, but the trend is decreasing, suggesting the military strategy is succeeding and an end is in sight, public support often remains stable. Conversely, a sudden spike in recent casualties, even if the total historical number is low, signals a failing strategy to the public and rapidly erodes approval for the war effort. Furthermore, public opinion regarding casualties is not uniform. It is heavily influenced by domestic political polarization. Research indicates that conservative voters are generally less sensitive to mounting casualties, maintaining support for military action despite rising death tolls, often tying their support to institutional loyalty and national security imperatives. Liberal voters, by contrast, exhibit high casualty sensitivity, rapidly withdrawing support for military interventions as the human cost increases. This deep polarization generates distinct strategic incentives for wartime leaders, who must carefully calibrate their military campaigns and rhetorical justifications to satisfy the specific ideological thresholds of their partisan bases. Elite rhetoric plays a crucial role in framing the necessity of this sacrifice. To sustain support through periods of heavy losses, presidents from Woodrow Wilson to Joe Biden have utilized the vocabulary of duty, sacrifice, and American civil religion to elevate the loss of life from a senseless tragedy to a sacred national obligation. Following the September 11 attacks, President George W. Bush successfully marshaled overwhelming public support for the invasion of Iraq by framing the conflict as an existential necessity, utilizing stark us versus them rhetoric to justify the impending casualties in the global war on terror. However, as the Iraq War devolved into a protracted insurgency and the prospect of a decisive, clear victory faded, the public's initial tolerance for casualties evaporated, leading to severe political repercussions for the administration during the 2006 midterm elections. Ultimately, the American public is willing to tolerate casualties, but only if they firmly believe the sacrifice is purchasing a tangible, strategic victory that aligns with core national interests. Enshrining the fallen, commemoration, identity, and national myth-making. How a nation chooses to memorialize its casualties dictates how future generations will interpret the concept of war, duty, and citizenship. The commemoration of American military loss has evolved from the haphazard, anonymous battlefield burials of the 18th century to grand, solemn architectural statements that weave the dead directly into the national mythology. During the American Civil War, the sheer volume of bodies overwhelmed existing local infrastructure, leading to the creation of the National Cemetery System to provide a dignified resting place for the Union dead. In the immediate aftermath of the conflict, the Grand Army of the Republic, GAR, a politically powerful Union veterans organization led by General John A. Logan, formalized the grassroots practice of Decoration Day in 1868. By issuing General Orders No. 11, Logan called on citizens to strew flowers on the graves of soldiers, beginning a process of national healing that eventually transformed into the federal holiday of Memorial Day, expanding over time to honor the fallen of all American wars. Following the unprecedented, industrialized carnage of World War I, the mechanism of commemoration shifted toward the symbolic weight of anonymity. The sheer destructive power of artillery meant that thousands of men were obliterated, leaving no identifiable remains. In 1921, inspired by British and French precedents, the United States exhumed 4 unknown soldiers from French cemeteries and selected one to be interred at Arlington National Cemetery. The tomb of the unknown soldier, inscribed with the poignant words "Who rests in honored glory, an American soldier known but to God," became a profound site of national myth-making. Guarded continuously since 1926 by the Sentinels of the 3rd U.S. Infantry Regiment, the Old Guard, the tomb serves as a proxy grave for every American family whose son never returned, elevating the anonymous casualty to a secular saint and embodying the ultimate, selfless sacrifice for the state. Over the decades, unknowns from World War II and the Korean War were added to the crypts. A Vietnam unknown was interred in 1984, but advancements in DNA technology allowed those remains to be identified in 1998 as Air Force First Lieutenant Michael J. Blassie, illustrating how modern science is slowly erasing the concept of the unknown soldier. The cultural trauma and bitter political divisions of the Vietnam War forced yet another evolution in how casualties were remembered. The conflict left a painful legacy regarding those who were unaccounted for, sparking the creation of the POW/MIA flag in 1971. Designed by Newt Heisley at the behest of Mary Hoff and the National League of Families, the stark black and white flag featuring a gaunt silhouette and a watchtower serves as a constant, politically charged reminder of the living missing. Flown beneath the American flag at federal installations, it symbolizes the state's unending obligation to its captured and missing warriors, refusing to allow them to fade into historical obscurity. This shift toward acknowledging the individual, rather than just the collective glory of the state, culminated in the creation of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. Dedicated in 1982 and designed by architect Maya Lind, the memorial actively eschewed classical, towering triumphalism in favor of a minimalist, V-shaped black granite wall sunk into the earth. Etched into the reflective stone are the names of over 58,000 dead and missing, listed chronologically by date of casualty rather than by rank or alphabetical order. This design forces the observer to confront the overwhelming, localized scale of human loss, allowing visitors to see their own reflections superimposed over the names of the dead. It democratizes grief, stripping away the rhetoric of victory, defeat, or geopolitical strategy, and leaves only the stark, irrefutable reality of the casualty itself. These commemorative practices are deeply tied to the specific identities of the military services themselves. As noted by Carl Bilder in The Masks of War, the military branches engage in institutional myth-making to preserve their specific cultures. The Army views itself as the servant of the nation, measuring its worth in its citizenry. The Navy worships at the altar of tradition and maritime platforms, while the Marine Corps fosters a fierce cult of elitism centered on the myth that every Marine is a rifleman. When casualties occur, they are processed through these distinct institutional lenses, reinforcing the unique warrior ethos of each branch while simultaneously contributing to the broader tapestry of American sacrifice. Conclusion. The American military casualty is not merely a data point in the ledger of conflict. It is a mirror reflecting the maturation, the technological prowess, and the moral compromises of the United States. In the Revolutionary and Civil Wars, casualties were a shared, mass demographic experience that forged the geographical boundaries and the constitutional soul of the nation. In the world wars, they were the grim, necessary currency expended to defeat fascism and purchase global hegemony. Today, shielded by the miraculous interventions of tactical combat casualty care and insulated by the structure of an all-volunteer force, the physical death of an American service member is a statistical rarity compared to the bloodletting of the past. Yet, as the absolute number of fatalities has decreased, the psychological, cultural, and political weight of each individual casualty has amplified dramatically. The modern casualty bears the brunt of an isolated warrior caste, suffering from complex, survivable physical wounds and profound moral injuries that transition the long-term cost of war from the foreign battlefield to the domestic homeland. Whether leveraged by politicians to rally patriotic fervor, captured by photojournalists to turn the tide of public opinion, or meticulously etched into black granite to heal a fractured nation, the casualty remains the ultimate, solemn arbiter of American foreign policy. So long as the United States projects its power across the globe, the blood of its service members will continue to be the indelible ink with which the American mythos is written, forever binding the living to the memory of the dead.